Hey guys, Sebastian here with another Cardano update. In this week's video, we're going to go over this weekly report, and then afterwards, going to briefly go over some points that were not touched in the weekly report. But before I get into that, I just want to say that I started a Patreon. You can find me at patreon.com/SebastianDLLNT. If you want to support my videos, feel free to sign up as a Patreon. There are different tiers, different goals, and all that stuff's all set up. I'll have a link in the description if you're interested in helping me across this journey. Alright, so getting started. The first thing is talking about the GHC update. So this is the third week where we're talking about this. You can still find the pull request here, where they're not only upgrading the Haskell compiler, but also a bunch of other stuff. And if you want to hear more about this, you can go watch my video from 2 weeks ago where I kind of go into this in more detail. Next one is, I should mention it. For this one, the reason it's not done yet is just because they're having some issues with the continuous integration. So you can see this continuous integration is failing. They're trying to figure out what's wrong. So the code itself should be fine, hopefully, but they're trying to figure out this like a technical detail. Next one is talking about efficient block storage. So I went over this last week. So somebody made up a proposal to describe what an efficient block storage method would look like. You can see the change here, and if you go view, you'll just see their document talking about the requirements, what it looks like, and all this kind of stuff. They're having some discussion on here about what efficient block storage looks like. And as usual, you can always find all these links in the description of the YouTube video. So if you want to read and possibly contribute to the discussion, feel free to check out this page. Talk about fixing the block version update. I'm actually not too sure what this is talking about, so if somebody knows, I'd be interested to know about, but I couldn't figure out anything like in particular related to this. For the benchmarking, I showed you guys this very briefly last week, but there's been kind of like more progress on this. So this is the wallet bench task. So there's actually like two benchmarks going on. One of them is this one, where it's like a benchmark for the wallet in general, which I didn't show last week, where they added a web API benchmarking tool. So anybody who wants to do a benchmark of their wallet for whatever purposes, you can look into this setup, and it'll generate this report, which you can see over here, which generates a lot of information about the results of this benchmark run. So if you're interested in this, you can read the description to figure out how to set up. The other one is this benchmark for the HTTP block sync. So we saw last week that they were having trouble rendering the graph for the benchmark, but now it looks like the graph is done. It's on the GitHub comment. So you can see they're implementing, I guess you can't see because I'm in the way. Let me just lift myself up here, or you still can't see it. Yeah, so they're implementing network difficulty, which is up here. Peers, so this is like a peer sync. So if you download all the blocks from your peers versus an HTTP block, HTTP based block syncing, you can see the HTTP based block syncing is much faster. So this is kind of the benchmark, the result of this feature they've been working on. So it's nice to see that they're finishing up with the benchmark and all this kind of stuff, and everything seems to be going well. Next one, they're talking about the reliable shutdown. So a lot of people have been pointing this out, that due to unreliable shutdown, it can sometimes cause your wallet to be stuck on connecting to network forever. And sometimes there's been like shutdowns where you're trying to shut down your node and it just takes like a few minutes or something, and so they've been trying to do a bunch of things related to this shutdown, which I believe is down here. Yeah, so they added some logs related to shutdown to try and debug this stuff easier. They added some kill node on async exception. They added some like a new killing for Windows, where you can see they changed like the behavior a bit for how it handles on Windows. And you can see they've got lastly this PR right here, this pull request which takes their branch called reliable shutdown, which contains all their fixes related to this issue, and merges it into develop. So if you want to do like a follow the progress of the entire reliable shutdown process, the entire story, you can just look at this one pull request, which is to say they're merging their entire branch that everybody's contributing to the develop, which is the one they're working on. So it's good to see that they're making progress on this, and I'm sure it'll make people's lives easier. Next one, they're talking about the Exchange onboarding and support. I think this is probably like one of the most exciting things in this report, actually. So if we look, they've actually done a bunch of change for the API. So they recently announced the version 1 of the API's release. So the previous version was version 0. Now they've got version 1 released, and they got a very fancy looking documentation up for how it works. You can see the pull request for this documentation. You might have noticed if you bookmark the page for the old API will now just say page not found instead of redirecting to the new one. This is done by this pull request right here, where they changed the URLs around. And I'm not sure if this was on purpose or not, but they made the old page just be deleted. And you have to update your bookmark to now point to this like a V1 page as opposed to this one with no V1, which will just be like a page not found, which I think they should fix, but like I don't know. They've also been doing some Exchange documentation, which also I think is pretty exciting. So if you look over here, yeah, they've got a document for Exchange onboarding, which is a whole like actual documentation for if you're an Exchange and you want to list ADA, here's how you go about it. So this is going to be really nice for people who want to integrate with the ecosystem. They've got some other like cleanup stuff, like catching errors. They've got some other work still left to be done. So this is also mentioned in the technical report that they've got like this one thing remaining on the API V1 transactions. We're talking about adding timestamps to the output. I believe that's mentioned somewhere in here. Yeah, they mentioned that the code for the V1 is still like beta, so you have to use that at your own risk, but they should be like fairly done and completely done soon enough. And lastly, they're talking about implementing a client for the wallet V1 API, where they're talking about implementing client using a serve-on client system. And if you want to know more about this specific design and how it works, Matt Parsons, which authored this pull request, who wrote this feature, actually wrote a blog post on the same topic. You can see March 14, he wrote a blog topic about kind of like what he did, how it works. This is not specific to Cardano. It's more specific to like the Haskell library he used. But if you're interested in kind of knowing more about this, you might be interested in this article. So I'll link this article into the YouTube description if you're interested in reading it. Next up, they're talking about the implementation of paper wallets, which is nearly done. We saw last week that they had some pictures up. So you can see the UI interface inside Daedalus, which shows you how to generate your wallet. You can see what the paper wallet will look like, which I think it looks actually really good, very good art. And so this is like almost done, and they're just like doing a bit more work on here. But if you want to keep track of it, you can keep track of that pull request. That's like a single pull request for the entire feature, so you can keep track of it there. Next, they're talking about the wallet backend. So we saw the wallet backend benchmarking just a bit earlier in this video. Next, they're talking about this TLS check. We saw this briefly in the last video. You can see the pull request for here for like one part of it, which is like they're disabling TLS for Swagger commands. They're trying to do like a more manual tuning for this TLS, but they're talking about how like it's a complicated system, and so they're waiting for like a specialist to like a tuning on this, which is like the right thing to do. But it just means it'll take a bit more time for this like TLS related feature. But that's fine, I think. Next one is the wallet seed restoration. So we saw in the previous week they're trying to do async recovery of your wallet, given your seed. So you remember in the previous release they made the recovery of your wallet much faster, and now they're trying to make it async. They made a part where you can async the actual data, and now they're making a different part for the async, which is let me see right here. Yeah, not only the wallet balance, which they've already done, that's already complete. I believe there's like the pull request for it, but also the wallet history, which will be updated asynchronously. And the pull request for that is right here. You can see it's emerged, and you can kind of look into it if you're interested, which is pretty good. I think people used to be complaining a lot about the slow wallet restore. I think these complaints have basically disappeared since they've made it a lot better and a lot faster, and they continue to work on this, so it'll be even better experience going forward. Oh yeah, here's where they're mentioning the API view on transaction endpoint still open and waiting for review. We saw this a bit earlier in the video. This is what I was talking about. Next up, networking. They're talking about the block syncing and NTP subsystem issue. I'm actually not sure like where they talked about this. I couldn't find any mention of this on the GitHub repository, but they're working on this apparently. Next up, the DevOps has created a Linux installer. So I showed this to you guys, I believe last week, where they put up on their GitHub all the installation stuff for the Linux wallet, Linux installer for the wallet, and they're not saying it's working. It should be good. They're doing internal testing and review, and for all these Linux users out there, that should be coming fairly soon. Next up, they're talking about Zendesk. So if you're not sure what Zendesk is, it's the system they're using to handle the logs you send from the wallet. So you might know that in the newest version of the wallet, they added a feature such that if something goes wrong, you can report the error directly to IOHK, along with the logs of the error generated by the system. And these are going to their Zendesk system, I believe. So they're working on making that system better. So I think they Charles mentioned at some point how many logs they've received so far, but they received like a lot of logs from a lot of people. So they're trying to do some classification of those logs to try and better sort through all the issues that have been reported. Next up is the delegation. They're talking about a new research paper that they've been working on, which is nice. And we don't see the paper yet, but I'm sure we'll see it eventually. They're talking about, I think the more important stuff in this thing in this section is that they're talking about how they wanted to make a exchange address type for delegation. They're saying that they will have this for the first version of delegation. So if you're not sure what this is say like for proof of stake, all of the delegation is owned by everybody who has a certain percentage of the network, right? As far as coins are concerned. And you can imagine a lot of the coins are currently held in exchanges. So that means the exchanges end up having a large control over the network because, for example, Binance might own like a 3% of all the ADA tokens, and therefore they own like 3% of the delegation, and therefore 3% of the block creation, which is not really ideal. So to get around this, they want to have a special address for exchanges that is such that if you own ADA on this address, it is not included for staking purposes in order to get around this. And this is what they're talking about. So they're saying they've been talking about this for a while, and they're just saying that they've decided to have this in the first version of the protocol. Next one is the K and IELE update. So we saw briefly last week where they're talking about how a lot of this work will be done by a group called Runtime Verifications. So if you want to know more about this, you can go look up the Runtime Verification GitHub page. They have a GitHub group where they talk about the IELE process and EVM specification in K and all this kind of stuff. And whenever you work with a different company, there's like, all these issues where like you have to figure out how you're going to communicate, how you're going to merge your different styles and this kind of stuff. And they're just saying they're making progress and kind of working out all the kinks and how they're going to cooperate on this. Sidechains, they're talking about how they're trying to get a paper submitted in May, which is good progress. I'm looking forward in May to see their research on sidechains and how they're progressing on this problem. For the smart contract language, they're just talking about this. It's kind of similar things up here. They're talking about how they're trying to use UTrack, which I believe is the system IOHK uses to keep track of their issues and updates and all that stuff. So they're saying they're trying to get them to onboard onto their system to just make everything easier and make communication easier. Lastly, oh yeah, I forgot, I have the runtime verification GitHub page open right here, so you can see they've got a few different things up here. And if you wanted, they'll have this link in the description so you can go check out their work. Yeah, lastly, talking about Reagan, which is doing good progress. So we saw last week Reagan briefly, which was mentioned in a tweet by Charles, where essentially there's this concept in computer science of like a fuzzy testing, it's like a mutation testing. There's like a few different names for it, but essentially you try and like permute your code to try and find either permute your code or permute the input data to try and find bugs and problems automatically. And this is kind of what they're talking about, which is why they're saying there's a lot of test cases executed, because this is like essentially generating new test cases. And they're talking about how they need more compute capacity. So the reason why this happens, because you can imagine if you like just generate a bunch of test cases, which is what the system does, eventually you need a computer to run all these test cases to make sure everything passes. And so to do that, you need a fair amount of compute power. Marlowe, which we also saw last week, is the team in charge of the domain-specific language for like a financial smart contracts. And they're talking about how they decided to like kind of postpone their work a bit, and will not submit at a crypto conference. Instead, the paper will be completed sometime in March. So we should be able to see it fairly soon. And then once the paper is complete, then they'll start doing presentations in April and progress and a demo and all this kind of stuff. So it's like a slightly delayed, but we should see it coming up fairly soon. Lastly, they're talking about asset locality and accounting. So this is talking about if you remember from the roadmap, one of their points on the roadmap is the accounting model, where they're talking about how to try and get their network, which uses, so the Cardano settlement layer uses the UTXO model, which is used by Bitcoin, whereas the computation layer uses the account-based model used by Ethereum. And they wanted to do some more formal investigation as to how these models cooperate with each other. And they've got a paper now on the subject fairly recently, I believe like last week, that they put out, where the title is like chimeric ledgers, and they're trying to figure out formally whether or not these two models, the UTXO model and count-based model, are how should I say, compatible. So if you're interested in this research, you can check out the paper, read through it. It's like I feel like out of all the papers they've published, it's like one of the shorter ones. So this is like how many pages does it say anywhere? Strange, there's no page number. But you can see it just like from the scroll bar. It's like not too big. So if you're interested in kind of the more mathy side of things, you may want to like read through this paper. And I believe that's it for everything they wrote down on the technical report. A few other things down here. One is that they're still working on the wallet spec. So you remember the wallet spec, we've been talking about it for a while now. I have a video on my channel where I go through like one of the drafts for the wallet spec, and here they're adding some more to it. So they're still working on this like a mathematical wallet model of what a wallet should look like, which is kind of driving their development work for the dataless wallet. Next one, they've got some description of the architecture for the Explorer's frontend. So if you're interested in writing your own Explorer and you want to see the IOHK code to see how they did it, they have a bit more documentation on how their folders are laid out and how they made it all work. So you may be interested in reading this. Next up, they got this other pull request right here, which is pull request for quick check generation of inductive wallets. So this is also related to the wallet spec. So if you've seen the video by Duncan Coutts, he talks about how they want to have a system to test their wallet, which generates blockchains and blockchain data to have effective testing. So if you wanted to see code-wise how that looks like, you can look into this, and they've actually got a pretty lengthy discussion on the GitHub page about how this is implemented and how it works. And actually there's a lot of code to this. You can see there's 37 files and 38 commits, so this is like a fairly big feature. But if you're interested, you maybe want to go look this out. But it's good that they're making progress on this, because I think this is like a good initiative to make sure that the wallet is well tested and does not run into any problems in the future. They've got another pull request that's still in the works. Probably we'll see this in the next technical update, where they're talking about changes to the way peers are discovered in the network. So as a peer-to-peer network, whenever you're running the node, it has to connect to various peers and all this kind of stuff. And they've got some changes to the way that this works, which you may be interested in if you're interested in this kind of like distributed network and networking protocols. Lastly, I believe there's a few more things. This is another thing. So you remember in previous weeks we talked about IOHK wrote a guideline on uses of monads in their codebase, along with the guideline of use of exceptions in their codebase. And so they have a pull request right here where they're refactoring a lot of their code to kind of adhere to the documentation they wrote, the style they decided on. Sorry, so this is a pretty big pull request. This is for the transaction processing library. So if you've seen the recent video on the Cardano settlement layer, they talk about how the Cardano settlement layer is actually split up into many different modules that all work together. So the transaction processing is one module, and this is what this refactoring is for. Lastly, for code, they have this other change where they're trying to speed up the get wallet function, which is I think a relatively small change compared to some of the other stuff we've seen. But it's always nice to know they're working on performance features, because everybody wants their wallet to run very fast. So with this, it'll kind of speed up the process. Lastly, I just wanted to say that on the Cardano forums, they've now announced a Korean section. So if you're a Korean speaker or know any Korean friends who want a community to talk about Cardano, they can now hop into this forum, and you can see it's fairly active. There's a lot of activity here for quite a large variety of topics. So it's good to see the community is growing in this way. And that's it. That's the end of the video. So if you thought this video was helpful, you can subscribe to my channel. You can also find me on Twitter. As I mentioned before, I started a Patreon. So if you want to support me in my videos, I have a link to the Patreon link in the description. And as usual, you can also donate directly, because my ADA address is also in the description. Alright, so hopefully I'll see you guys next week.